Good afternoon. As promised, here's a Jane Eyre open mic. I am going to have us think about space, even though there are lots of interesting things that we could talk about. But I think thinking about space can also lend it to yourself to talking about gender or class, if that's interesting to you. The narrator's voice is also really interesting in this novel. So if we don't get to that through the topic of space, we will definitely address it. This is a really interesting first person narrator. Think about the subtitle of Jane Eyre too as an autobiography. So there were some really interesting spaces in Jane Eyre. Each of the homes that she lives at will be really important. So thinking about the Reed household, thinking about Lowood, the orphanage that she goes to, sort of like an orphanage, and then Thornfield Hall, and then the Rivers house, Moore house. So you'll have gotten to at least kind of the very beginnings of her time at Thornfield Hall. So if you haven't read Jane Eyre before, you might not know a lot about Moore House or a lot about the secrets of Thornfield Hall yet. But you'll definitely can talk about the Reed household, and you can talk about, or you could talk about Lowood if you wanted to. You also can think much smaller places or spaces in the novel. The Red Room is one of the most famous ones, if you'll remember that scene. I'm actually going to just read kind of the very opening of the novel and thinking about the window seat that Jane is in as a space. The other thing that I would like for you all to kind of try to incorporate into your open mic and your thinking about space is those sort of terms and ideas from that article that we briefly touched on at the end of class last time. So the sort of place and ideology. So thinking about place and differentiation, thinking about place as natural, right? And what are the problems with that? And also thinking about place as practice, like what do we do in spaces? So essentially that article is getting you to think about this idea of space as constructed. And so this is also a way where you can think about how when Jane is in a space, right, how does her performance of gender or her performance of class, how is that influenced by the space that she's in? And just also how the space itself is constructed through social practices and social rules, again, related to class and gender or race or something else. So just see if you can think about those categories a little bit while you're talking about it. So the opening of Jane Eyre reads like this. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, but since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early, the cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight with nipped fingers and toes. And I'm going to skip down a little bit. And then it reads how Eliza, John, and Georgiana were clustered round their mama in the drawing room. She lay reclined on a sofa by the fireside with her darlings about her. Me, she had dispensed from joining the group, saying she regretted to be kept under the necessity of keeping me at a distance. And she gives a rationale for why she's doing that. And then Jane says, a breakfast room adjoined the drawing room. I slipped in there. It contained a bookcase. I soon possessed myself of a volume, taking care that it should be one stored with pictures. I mounted into the window seat. Gathering up my feet, I sat cross-legged like a Turk, very interesting reference, and having drawn the red moreen curtain nearly closed, I was shrined in double retirement. And then she gets lost in her imagination reading or looking at pictures that are in the book. She can't actually read it yet. So just within those first few paragraphs of the novel, right, we have this sense of being outside but not liking it, right? Almost feeling claustrophobic outside and then having to come back inside. So that sort of outside versus inside space and how Jane feels about that and why. And then you have that sort of differentiation, right, of the chosen children, right, the real children in the drawing room by the fire with their mom there. So there's sort of that Victorian ideal of the happy home and the hearth. And then Jane is sent away from that space but then sort of claims her own space in this window seat. And then what she does in that window seat is important too. And then, of course, right after that scene, there is the conflict between her and John. So that's one example of how like space is just everywhere in this novel, but not just the spaces, but the way that Charlotte Bronte draws attention to the socially constructed nature of that space, and how so much of that space really influences Jane, her conception of herself, the formation of her identity. So I would love to see you pick a space, whether it's one of the big spaces of the houses or a small little space. That part doesn't matter. Go ahead and read part of the passage to us of where that space happens, and then what do you find interesting about that space, right? What happens in it? How does it affect Jane or some other character, or the reader for that matter?